Michael Rodriguez had lived in Evergreen Estates for 15 years, his modest ranch-style home nestled at the edge of a neighborhood backing onto a pristine natural creek. The property had been more than just a house to him. It was a sanctuary, a connection to the natural world that had drawn him to this quiet suburban development years ago. His late wife, Elena, had fallen in love with the property precisely because of its untouched natural beauty, the way the creek meandered through the landscape like a liquid lifeline. When they first moved in, the creek was a neighborhood treasure. Children would splash in its shallow waters during summer. Local wildlife thrived along its banks, and residents would often gather for informal community events near its picturesque shores. Michael remembered Elena's favorite weekends, planting native wildflowers along the creek's edge, watching butterflies dance between the delicate blooms and the water's surface. Now, everything was changing. What had once been a peaceful watersh was becoming the center of a brewing storm. The HOA president, Gerald Thompson, had recently begun a campaign to improve the creek area, which in reality meant blocking access, installing unsightly barriers, and effectively destroying the natural ecosystem that Michael and his neighbors had cherished for decades. Gerald was Moon Money, a recently retired corporate executive who had moved into the neighborhood only 3 years ago with the vision of transforming Evergreen Estates into what he called a premium residential environment. His background in corporate restructuring seemed to have given him a ruthless approach to neighborhood management. Where previous HOA leadership had been collaborative and community-focused, Gerald saw the neighborhood as a project to be optimized, a property to be managed with the same cold efficiency he had once applied to corporate spreadsheets. The first signs of trouble came subtly. Gerald began hosting HOA meetings with increasing frequency, pushing through proposals that seemed increasingly detached from the community's wishes. He spoke of property value optimization, of creating controlled natural spaces that would make Evergreen Estates more attractive to potential buyers. But Michael and several longtime residents saw through the rhetoric. This was less about improvement and more about control. Michael had watched the slow transformation with growing concern. The creek, which had been a natural shared resource, was being viewed as something to be contained, controlled, and ultimately commodified. Gerald's vision seemed to be turning the organic living landscape into something sterile and manufactured, a landscape illusion of nature rather than nature itself. Little did Gerald know that in Michael Rodriguez, he had encountered a formidable opponent. A retired environmental engineer with decades of experience in water resource management, Michael understood the ecological and legal complexities of water management far better than Gerald ever could. And he was not about to let the creek, a place of such personal and community significance, be destroyed without a fight. One crisp Saturday morning, Michael discovered a series of concrete barriers and chain-link fencing strategically placed along the creek's edge. The transformation was shocking. What had been an open, natural waterway now looked like a militarized zone. Gerald's handiwork was unmistakable. Massive concrete blocks, razor wire, and private property signs that seemed to ignore the natural water rights and established easements. The construction work had clearly been done overnight, with professional precision that suggested significant planning and expense. Heavy machinery tracks were still visible in the soft ground surrounding the creek, and the fresh concrete of the barriers gleamed in the morning light. Michael could see that multiple properties had been effectively cut off from their natural water access, the creek now looking more like a restricted industrial site than a community resource. As he walked along the newly installed barriers, Michael began to document everything. Years of professional training as an environmental engineer kicked in. He pulled out his smartphone, methodically taking photographs from multiple angles. Each image captured the extent of the destruction. Native plants crushed, natural drainage paths disrupted, and the creek's ecosystem brutally interrupted by Gerald's unilateral action. Neighboring residents began to emerge from their homes, equally shocked and confused. Sarah Martinez, a retired biology teacher who lived 2 houses down, approached Michael with a look of disbelief. "Have you seen what they've done?" she asked, her voice a mixture of anger and dismay. "Those barriers are blocking the natural water flow. This could cause serious drainage issues for the entire neighborhood." Michael knew she was right. The creek wasn't just a decorative feature of their neighborhood, it was a critical part of the local ecosystem and drainage system. By blocking and redirecting the water, Gerald was potentially creating significant environmental and property damage. Water always found its way, and if these barriers disrupted its natural path, the consequences could be devastating. He noticed the carefully placed private property signs, each one strategically positioned to claim ownership over what had always been considered a shared natural resource. The signs were professionally printed, likely a recent purchase by the HOA, with bold lettering that screamed of bureaucratic overreach. Michael recognized the legal game being played. Gerald was attempting to create a fait accompli, hoping that by acting quickly and decisively, he could establish a new status quo before anyone could effectively challenge him. But Michael was not about to let that happen. His mind was already racing with the potential legal and environmental implications. He knew the creek was protected by multiple local and state regulations. Water rights were complex, and the idea that an HOA president could unilaterally block a natural waterway was not just questionable, it was potentially illegal. As more neighbors gathered, sharing their confusion and anger, Michael remained calm. This was not going to be a moment of spontaneous neighborhood revolt. This would be a carefully planned, legally strategic response. He had dealt with environmental challenges far more complex than this during his career, and he knew that patience, documentation, and precise legal action would be key. "Nobody touch anything," Michael advised the growing crowd. "We need to document everything exactly as it is right now." His voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating complex environmental regulations. The neighbors listened, sensing that Michael had a plan. What Gerald Thompson didn't realize was that in his attempt to control the neighborhood, he had just awakened a force far more formidable than he could have imagined. Michael Rodriguez was about to show him exactly what happened when you underestimated a community's right to protect its natural resources. Determined to fight back, Michael transformed his home office into a war room of sorts. His late wife Alina's meticulously organized filing cabinets, once filled with her botanical research, now became an invaluable resource for his mission. Stacks of local ordinance books, environmental protection manuals, and water rights documents covered every available surface. Michael's background as an environmental engineer proved crucial. He knew that fighting Gerald would require more than emotional appeals. It would demand a forensic approach to local regulations. He began by pulling every possible document related to the neighborhood's original development, the creek's historical status, and municipal water management policies. His first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Hidden in the neighborhood's original development papers, he discovered a decades-old conservation easement that explicitly protected the creek's natural flow. It was a document Gerald had likely never seen, or hoped no one would find. The easement, created when the original development was first planned, guaranteed public access to the waterway and protected its ecological integrity. Sarah Martinez proved to be an unexpected ally. As a retired biology teacher, she had an extensive network of local environmental activists and former colleagues. Over several late-night phone calls and strategy sessions in Michael's kitchen, they began to map out a comprehensive approach. Sarah brought photographs documenting the creek's ecosystem, images of rare local plants, wildlife habitats, and the intricate balance that Gerald's barriers threatened to destroy. The neighborhood itself was a powder keg of frustration. Michael discovered that Gerald's heavy-handed approach hadn't just affected the creek. It was part of a broader pattern of increasingly restrictive HOA policies. Residents who had previously been silent were now sharing stories of petty enforcement, unreasonable fines, and a growing sense that the HOA had become more of a dictatorship than a representative body. Michael began organizing informal meetings, carefully avoiding HOA channels. His backyard became a gathering place for concerned residents. They would meet in the evenings, sharing information, documenting their experiences, and building a united front. Each meeting revealed another layer of Gerald's overreach: landscaping fines for native plants, restrictions on family gatherings, increasingly bizarre rules that seemed designed to control rather than support the community. The local university proved to be an unexpected resource. Michael reached out to the environmental law department, sharing his documentation. Professor Elena Rodriguez, no relation but a name that made Michael smile at the coincidence, took a keen interest in the case. She saw it as a potential landmark study in HOA overreach and environmental protection. What began as a personal mission was quickly becoming a community movement. Michael compiled a comprehensive dossier: photographic evidence, legal documents, environmental impact assessments, and personal testimonies. Each piece of documentation was meticulously labeled, cross-referenced, and backed up in multiple locations. Gerald had made a fundamental mistake. He had treated the neighborhood as a corporate asset to be managed, forgetting that communities are living, breathing entities with their own collective memory and strength. Michael was assembling not just a legal case, but a narrative of community resilience. As winter began to give way in early spring, the groundwork was being laid for a challenge that would shake Evergreen Estates to its foundation. Michael knew the fight was just beginning, but for the first time he felt a sense of hope. The creek, a symbol of natural flow and community connection, would not be silenced easily. With a meticulously prepared dossier of evidence, Michael's approach was surgical and multi-pronged. His first move was to file formal complaints with multiple government agencies, each carefully crafted to trigger a comprehensive investigation. The County Water Management Department received a detailed report highlighting potential violations of water protection regulations. The Environmental Protection Agency got a comprehensive brief documenting the ecosystem disruption. Local municipal authorities were presented with a clear timeline of HOA overreach and potential legal infractions. But Michael knew that bureaucratic channels moved slowly. He needed a more immediate strategy that would apply direct pressure to Gerald and the HOA board. Drawing from his years of professional experience navigating complex regulatory landscapes, he began to explore every possible avenue of challenge. His research uncovered a critical vulnerability. The creek ran through a designated floodplain, which meant it was subject to strict federal and state environmental protections. The barriers Gerald had installed could be a direct violation of multiple regulatory codes. Michael contacted a former colleague, James Reyes, now working with the Army Corps of Engineers, who confirmed the potential regulatory minefield Gerald had unknowingly entered. The next phase of Michael's plan involved mobilizing community resources. He helped organize a series of strategic meetings with local environmental groups, water rights advocates, and community legal clinics. Each meeting was carefully documented, with detailed minutes and action plans. He understood that creating a paper trail was as important as the actions themselves. Sarah Martinez's network proved invaluable. Through her connections, Michael arranged for independent environmental assessments of the creek. A team of graduate students from the local university's environmental science program conducted a comprehensive ecological survey, documenting the potential damage caused by Gerald's barriers. Their report would become a critical piece of evidence, providing scientific credibility to the community's concerns. Michael also began to explore the financial implications of Gerald's actions. He discovered that the HOA's insurance policy might not cover intentional modifications to natural waterways. By carefully drafting a series of formal inquiries to the HOA's insurance provider, he created additional pressure points that would force the board to reconsider their approach. The local media became an unexpected ally. Michael strategically shared portions of the documentation with an investigative reporter he knew from previous environmental advocacy work. While he was careful not to sensationalize the issue, he understood the power of public scrutiny. A well-placed story could bring external attention to the HOA's actions. Behind the scenes, Michael was also preparing for potential legal action. He consulted with 3 different environmental law attorneys, each of whom confirmed the strength of the community's position. They helped him refine his documentation, ensuring that every complaint, every piece of evidence was bulletproof. What Gerald didn't realize was that Michael was fighting a war of attrition. Each complaint, each investigation, each inquiry would consume time and resources. The HOA would be forced to respond to multiple fronts simultaneously, stretching their capacity to maintain control. As spring approached, the groundwork was laid. Michael had transformed what could have been a simple neighborhood dispute into a multi-layered challenge that threatened to unravel Gerald's entire approach to neighborhood management. The creek, once a quiet waterway, was now the focal point of a battle that would determine the very nature of community governance in evergreen estates. Michael allowed himself a small smile. The real fight was just beginning. Michael's strategy was about to enter its most critical phase. He understood that the most effective way to challenge Gerald's authority was to create a cascading series of official investigations that would gradually paralyze the HOA's ability to function. His first target was the neighborhood's water infrastructure. Using his engineering background, Michael drafted a meticulously detailed report to the local water utility, highlighting potential safety concerns created by the creek barriers. He included technical diagrams showing how the unauthorized modifications could compromise drainage systems, potentially putting the entire neighborhood at risk during heavy rainfall or flooding. The water utility's response was immediate. Within days, a team of inspectors arrived, their white trucks creating a spectacle that drew the attention of every resident. They methodically examined the creek, the barriers, and the surrounding infrastructure. Each inspector's clipboard became a weapon of bureaucratic precision, documenting every minute detail of Gerald's unauthorized modifications. Simultaneously, Michael reached out to the county's drainage department. He presented evidence suggesting that the creek barriers could create significant flood risks for neighboring properties. The drainage experts were particularly concerned about altered water flow patterns that could potentially damage public infrastructure. Their investigation meant additional teams would soon descend on evergreen estates. The Environmental Protection Agency proved to be another crucial ally. The graduate students' ecological survey Michael had previously arranged now bore fruit. Their comprehensive report documented the potential destruction of local wildlife habitats, including several protected species that relied on the creek's ecosystem. This triggered a more intensive environmental investigation, complete with specialists who would carefully examine every inch of the altered waterway. Local building code enforcement became Michael's next point of pressure. He anonymously reported potential violations in the construction of the creek barriers, suggesting they might have been installed without proper permits. The building inspector's office, known for its meticulous approach, began a thorough review of all recent HOA construction projects. What made Michael's approach so effective was its layered complexity. Each investigation was legitimate, backed by solid evidence and professional documentation. Gerald found himself simultaneously responding to water utility concerns, environmental investigations, drainage department inquiries, and building code enforcement actions. The neighborhood watched in a mixture of awe and disbelief. What had begun as one man's quest to protect a local creek was now a full-scale administrative takedown of the HOA's leadership. Residents who had previously been afraid to speak out now found their voices, sharing additional concerns and providing supplementary evidence to the various investigating bodies. Gerald's attempts to counter the investigations only made things worse. His aggressive responses and attempts to block or minimize the inquiries only drew more scrutiny. Each angry email, each defensive phone call became additional evidence of his mismanagement. By the end of the month, Evergreen Estates had become a bureaucratic nightmare. Utility trucks, government vehicles, and official inspectors had become a constant presence. The HOA's regular operations ground to a near halt as Gerald was forced to divert all his time and resources to responding to the multiple investigations. Michael watched the transformation with a sense of calculated satisfaction. This was not about personal vengeance, but about restoring balance to a community that had lost its way. The creek, that simple, natural boundary that had brought neighbors together for decades, was becoming the catalyst for fundamental change. The first cracks in Gerald Thompson's carefully constructed facade appeared during a contentious HOA board meeting that would go down in neighborhood legend. What began as a routine gathering quickly devolved into a public reckoning that would define the future of Evergreen Estates. Gerald arrived that evening with his typical air of corporate confidence, expecting to manage the narrative as he had done in countless boardroom meetings throughout his career. But Michael had been meticulous in his preparation. Seated strategically throughout the community center were residents armed with documented evidence, each one a potential witness to Gerald's systematic overreach. The meeting began with Gerald attempting to present his vision for the neighborhood's improvement. His PowerPoint presentation, once a tool of corporate mastery, now seemed like a relic of his past life. As he spoke about strategic infrastructure modifications and property value optimization, the room grew increasingly tense. Sarah Martinez was the first to challenge him directly. With the precision of a former science teacher, she presented the environmental impact report documenting the creek's ecological damage. Each slide was a damning indictment of Gerald's actions: rare plant species disrupted, wildlife habitats destroyed, natural water flow compromised. One by one, residents began to speak. A retired engineer highlighted the potential infrastructure risks. A local real estate agent explained how Gerald's actions could actually decrease property values. A young family shared how the creek barriers had affected their children's ability to interact with nature. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. James Henderson, a longtime resident and former municipal lawyer, presented a comprehensive legal brief detailing multiple violations of local ordinances, HOA bylaws, and environmental protection regulations. Gerald's defense began to crumble. His carefully maintained composure started to crack, revealing the desperation beneath. He argued, he threatened. He attempted to redirect the conversation, but the evidence was overwhelming. Each attempt to deflect only made him appear more guilty. The turning point came when Michael presented the compiled investigations: water utility reports, environmental agency findings, building code violation notices. Each document was a nail in the coffin of Gerald's leadership. The sheer volume of official documentation was staggering. Behind the scenes, the legal and financial implications were mounting. The HOA's insurance provider had begun to distance themselves, concerned about potential liability. Multiple government agencies were now conducting formal investigations. Gerald was facing not just removal from his position, but potential legal consequences. Board members who had previously supported Gerald began to distance themselves. What had seemed like a unified front now fractured under the weight of evidence. Some board members approached Michael privately, seeking a way to minimize their own potential liability. The vote for Gerald's removal was almost anticlimactic. What had once seemed unthinkable now felt inevitable. With a near-unanimous decision, Gerald was stripped of his position as HOA president. His corporate tactics, which had worked so effectively in his previous career, had completely failed him in this community setting. As Gerald gathered his things and prepared to leave, the room was silent. This was not a moment of triumph, but of collective reflection. The neighborhood had confronted something deeper than one man's overreach. They had challenged a mindset that saw community as something to be controlled rather than nurtured. Michael watched quietly, feeling no sense of personal victory. This had never been about defeating Gerald, but about protecting something far more important: the delicate ecosystem of community itself. The aftermath of Gerald's removal was not a simple victory, but the beginning of a profound transformation for Evergreen Estates. Michael found himself at the center of a community reimagining its identity, a role he had never sought but now understood was necessary. The first order of business was the creek itself. A community-wide restoration project brought residents together in a way they hadn't experienced in years. Professional environmental consultants worked alongside local volunteers, removing the concrete barriers and restoring the natural ecosystem. Children who had never truly explored the creek now learn about local flora and fauna, their hands deep in the soil, planting native species and rebuilding wildlife habitats. Sarah Martinez spearheaded an environmental education program that became a model for other neighborhoods. What had begun as a local conflict transformed into a broader conversation about community stewardship, urban ecology, and the delicate balance between development and natural preservation. Local schools began bringing students to study the restored creek, turning the site of conflict into a living classroom. The new HOA leadership was fundamentally different. Instead of a top-down corporate model, they implemented a truly democratic approach. Monthly meetings became collaborative sessions where every resident could contribute. They established an environmental advisory committee, with Michael serving as a primary consultant, ensuring that future decisions would prioritize both community needs and ecological sustainability. Financially, the neighborhood saw unexpected benefits. The restoration project and the new approach to community management attracted positive attention. Property values, which Gerald had claimed would drop without his strict control, actually began to rise. Young families and environmentally conscious professionals became increasingly interested in evergreen estates, drawn by its unique approach to community living. Michael found an unexpected sense of purpose in this new chapter. The fight had never been about him, but about preserving something larger than himself. Elena's memory lived on in the renewed connection between the residents and their natural surroundings. The creek, once a point of contention, now served as a symbol of community resilience and collective action. The legal and bureaucratic battles had broader implications. Other neighborhoods began reaching out, seeking guidance on how to address similar issues of HOA overreach and environmental protection. Michael and Sarah found themselves consulting with community groups across the region, sharing the lessons learned from evergreen estates. Not everything was perfect. Some residents who had supported Gerald initially felt displaced, struggling to understand the new collaborative approach. Healing took time, and the community worked deliberately to create space for dialogue and understanding. Michael understood that true change was not about winning or losing, but about finding common ground. As summer approached, the creek thrived. Native plants returned, wildlife populations began to recover, and the water ran clear and free. Children played along its banks much as they had years ago before Gerald's intervention. Residents who had once been strangers now worked together, sharing garden tools, watching each other's properties, creating the kind of genuine community that no set of rules could mandate. Michael would often sit on his back porch, watching the creek flow. It was a reminder that resistance was not about destruction, but about preservation. About understanding that true leadership meant listening, adapting, and working together. The creek, with its constant movement, its ability to find a path around obstacles, had been his greatest teacher. In the end, Evergreen Estates had become more than just a neighborhood. It was a testament to the power of community, the importance of environmental stewardship, and the transformative potential of collective action.